Baptist Church, if you're from around this area in Saskatchewan, there's a pretty good chance that you've experienced this sort of fall rite of passage. That when you went back to school in September, you spent some of your lunch hours at least running laps around the playground. You were training for this glorious day when they would pull you out of school for the whole day, load you onto the school bus and take you to Salt Coats or to Deer Park or Cherrydale, and you would get to compete in these cross-country races. If you remember these, you remember that near the finish line, there'd be a cluster of parents gathered, cheering people on for the last 100 yards or so of the race. And these parents, who I'm guessing haven't run many kilometers since the glory days of their own cross-country careers, they suddenly become experts, coaches, and cheerleaders. They shout, "Go for it, catch them, keep running, dig deep." And there at the finish line, all this drama unfolds, right? As leaders look over their shoulder and they see people behind closing, and they run a little harder, and the people behind run a little harder, and the gap begins to close, and it's dramatic stuff. But this year, when I went to watch one of the races, I found myself wrapped up not in the drama unfolding at the front of the pack, but in this story that unfolded way at the back. I mean, after everybody else was done, there were these two boys who had run the race, well, in that pattern that some of the runners have of running for a stretch and then walking for a stretch and catching their breath and then running for a stretch, and the stretches that they run for get shorter and the stretches that they walk for get longer, until at the end of the race they're both just running, or both just walking rather. And these two boys are last and dead last, and they're separated by maybe 15 yards or so. And as they approach the finish line, the boy in dead last says to the boy in second last, "Hey! Hey!" The boy in second last turns around and says, "What?" The boy in last says, "Do you want a tie? We could both get second last." And the boy in second last, at first he doesn't answer, but he's already beginning to slow down. He shrugs his shoulders, raises his palms to the sky and says, "Sure." And the two of them walk with peace treaty intact towards the finish line, shoulder to shoulder, tying for second last place. And the reason I got all caught up in that story is because I've been there before. I mean, in my own head, in my imagination, I'm always the guy out front, like leading the pack, running hard towards the finish line, but I know I've been there before. There's been times when I've said, "Hey, why are we running so hard? Why don't we just agree to tie? We could both get second last place." And you maybe think that could never be you. You are ultra competitive. You always need to be out front. But I bet you it's been me. I bet you it's been you. You know, people out front, they coast too. And we know they coast. We know this so well that we have a whole language in our culture for people who get out front and then coast. Right? We talk about people who rest on their laurels. Or in sports, when a team is like way out front, like 11-1, and they're going to be first place, and everybody knows how it's going to end, we talk about maybe they'll let their foot off the gas a little bit. Or when a student enters their last year of high school or college or university. And near the end of that year, it's pretty clear that they're going to pass and everything's going to be okay. And then the symptoms of this disease called senioritis, they begin to display themselves. And that whether we're at the back of the pack or way out front, there's this tendency sometimes to coast. And I want to take you to a Bible story today. It's about King Solomon. But it's important as we read it that we have some idea of the context that this story happens in. So it's actually near the end of Solomon's reign than the beginning. He's already withstood this coup attempt from his brother, because Solomon was supposed to be king, but his brother took a run at him, and Solomon survived that. Solomon's already built this incredibly successful, incredibly wealthy kingdom. He's had two major building projects that just become these signs to all the world and all of history of Solomon's glory. One is he builds this absolutely massive palace for himself. And the other is that he builds this glorious temple. It's a place for all of Israel to turn and worship and focus on God. And when that temple is built, it's dedicated. And in the dedication ceremony, Israel experiences this party unlike anything that they will likely ever experience again. And they take the Ark of the Covenant, this symbol of God's presence amongst the people and their relationship to him, and they move it from where it was in the tent of meeting to the temple. And when they do, God's presence, like his real presence, not just a symbol of it, but this thick cloud, it fills the temple with God's glory, and it's just full in there. And nobody can do anything other than just stand in awe of the glory of God. And that's it, this pinnacle moment. And then God shows up and he speaks to Solomon. Here's the passage I want to take you to. It's 1 Kings chapter 9. As soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods, and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them. And the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. The author, Mark Buchanan, reminds us that great big things can spin on top of small little words. That words, even small ones, sometimes the smallest of them have incredible power. And there's one of those incredibly powerful small words in this passage. It's only 2 letters long. It's as. It's this comparison between how God appeared to Solomon this first time at Gibeon and how he appears to Solomon this second time after the temple dedication in Jerusalem. And they're the same. At least they're a lot the same. And that's surprising. I mean, Solomon probably expected God to show up. We, as readers of this passage, we expect God to show up and say something. After all, this is the pinnacle of Solomon's reign. He's built this temple that is the culmination of not just 7 years of building, but decades of planning. God has filled the temple with his glory. Solomon has prayed this thoughtful, theological, full prayer. God just has to say something. So nobody is surprised, either readers or Solomon, that God shows up. What surprises us sometimes is how God shows up. Man, how often is that our experience in life? That we're surprised by how God shows up. We're expecting that if God would show up, he would just declare to the whole world how right we've always been. But then God shows up and he calls us to repent. We expect that if God would show up, that everything would be clear and we just know the way forward. And then God shows up and he just shows us one step. It says that's all for now. Or we expect that if God would show up, he would bring us healing and comfort and peace and everything would be okay. And then God shows up and he says, you know what? My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So often when God shows up, he surprises us. And when God shows up, he surprises Solomon because he appeared to him as he had the first time. And here's why that's a surprise. Because the second time is so different from the first. Because the first time God appeared to Solomon, Solomon describes himself as like a child who does not even know how to go out or come in. Solomon has been given this weighty task of being king, but he feels totally inadequate to it. He doesn't know how to do it. And then God shows up. And he gives him this blessing. But the second time, that's different. Solomon isn't a child anymore. He's a wise king. He's proven himself by bringing justice to the people of Israel. He's proven himself on the international stage, standing on his own 2 feet and making the situation of Israel better and better and better and better and better. Solomon has proved himself at every possibility. So when God shows up to the experienced and powerful and majestic King Solomon, you would expect that it would be different from the first time around, but here's the thing, it isn't. When God shows up the second time, it's the same as the first. And here's what I think God is saying by showing up the second time in the same way as he shows up the first time. So not so much has changed as Solomon thinks. Not so much has changed as Solomon thinks. See, I think Solomon, he kind of wants to rest on his laurels at this point in the story. He wants to be able to let his foot off the gas. He wants to be able to coast to the finish line because he's already done so much. He's already entering his senior year with a 4.0 with straight A's. He's 55 with $2 million in the bank and a rock-solid retirement plan. Solomon is 11-1 with 2 games left to play. He's earned the right to coast. But then God shows up, just as he had when Solomon was like a little child who didn't know how to go out, come in. And that's a little bit surprising. And you might think that I'm hanging a whole lot on 2 little words, and you'd be right, except for the way that the rest of the passage continues. You see, it's full of this ifness, that God gives these promises to Solomon again, but there's always an if. That David will never lack a son to sit on the throne, but if those sons, if they become disobedient, if they lead the people into disobedience, then there won't be a nation left to rule over, and there won't be a throne left to sit on. And God promises that his eyes will be on this temple forever, but if the people turn away, if they disobey, then this temple that God's eyes are on forever, it will become a heap of ruins. And the people will bear testimony, they'll bear witness to God, not through obedience and the accompanying blessing, but through disobedience and the accompanying curse. And one way or another, the whole earth is going to know about God and his glory. There's this ifness to the promise. And God, through this ifness, he's communicating something important to Solomon. He's communicating to Solomon that God is more concerned with the obedience of today than with the temple that Solomon built yesterday. God is more concerned with the obedience of today and tomorrow and the day after that than with the temple that Solomon built yesterday. If we look back at the prayer that Solomon prayed when he dedicated the temple, we see that Solomon was looking for some kind of guarantee. So in chapter 8, verse 25 and 26, Solomon prays this: "Now therefore, O Lord God of Israel, keep for your servant David my father what you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel, if only your sons pay close attention to their way to walk before me as you have walked before me. Now therefore, O God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant David my father." Here's what Solomon is saying: I want a guarantee. I want you to confirm it. You said you would build David a house and David's descendants would build you a house. I built you a house. So now confirm it, guarantee it, promise it, write it rock solid. You will build us a house. And God shows up as he had the first time. And he communicates this promise that is full of ifness. If you obey, if you keep walking, if you keep going, then. God is more concerned with the obedience of today than with the accomplishments of yesterday. This isn't just for Solomon either. It's for us as well. I mean, how many times do we in our walk of faith want to rest on our laurels? Do we want to just coast to the finish line? Or maybe we think we've crossed the finish line already. Like, we already prayed the prayer. We already decided to follow Jesus as Lord and Savior. What more is there after that? We've done it. But as long as there's breath in our lungs, our walk of obedience of faith, it isn't over. God is more concerned with our obedience today than with the prayer that we prayed yesterday. Or maybe we think we've been wet, we've been baptized, we've stood up there at the front of the church, we've given our testimony, we've proclaimed our faith for all to see. What more could there be? We're done. And now we get to just kind of coast, just slide towards the finish line. But God is more concerned with our obedience today and tomorrow and the day after that than with our baptism of yesterday. Or maybe we think we've done all these great things in the church, for God. You know, we've taught Sunday school or volunteered with the youth group or we've fostered kids or we've done it. And we've done enough of it that we've just earned this little pile of glory for ourselves, and surely God will say to us, that's enough. But God showed up to Solomon as he had the first time and said, if. Solomon, keep going. Solomon, I'm more concerned with your obedience of today and tomorrow than with your achievements of yesterday. And God shows up and he says the same thing to us. That he is more concerned with our obedience of today and tomorrow and the day after than all the wonderful things that we did yesterday. And you see, the life of faith, it's got no finish line. We don't get to just throw our hands up in the air and say we're done. As long as there's breath in our lungs, we are called to keep going. There's room for grace in this. That's Solomon's prayer as he dedicates the temple. When the people turn from you, when there's drought and famine, when there's disease and warfare, people can still turn to God, turn to the temple, find his forgiveness and his grace and his goodness. There's room for grace in this journey. But there isn't a finish line. There isn't a day when we get to rest on our accomplishments and say everything is done. God says to us, keep going, keep running, no coasting.